Good afternoon, everyone. It's time for Mrs. Ballou Reads, and if you remember, last week we started reading Tumtum Nutmeg, Adventures Beyond Nutmouse Hall, stories by Emily Bearn and pictures by Nick Price, published by Little Brown and Company. Remember, Tumtum and Nutmeg are two mice that live in this wonderful mansion inside a broom closet in a small kind of decrepit house, and there are two children that live in the house. Arthur and Lucy don't have a lot of money, don't have a lot of food, and Arthur and Lucy have started doing things for them. Tumtum and Nutmeg have started doing things for them, and they believe now that they've got a fairy of sorts because they've been communicating through letters. And we're going to read some chapters today. We're going to start with chapter 4. Arthur and Lucy had been dreading their long winter vacation at home, but it was turning out to be more exciting than they ever could have imagined. Nutmeg visited almost every night, and when they woke up to find her funny little presents under their pillows, it felt just like Christmas. Even though Christmas had happened several weeks ago, and they hadn't had nearly so many presents then as they were getting now. But just at the point at which they felt things could hardly get any nicer, something horrible happened. One morning, while the Mildews were all sitting down to breakfast of canned rice pudding, they heard a car stopping outside in the lane. Then there was the sound of someone cursing, followed by a sharp rap on the front door. "I wonder who that could be," Mr. Mildew said anxiously. He always felt unsettled by visitors, even the postman. As he said it, the rapping started up again, cross and impatient. His children followed him into the hall, and when he opened the door, their hearts sank. For there was Aunt Ivy and a taxi driver trailing up the path behind her, carrying 5 suitcases. "Your doorbell's not working, Walter," she said sourly, pushing past Mr. Mildew into the hall and ignoring the children entirely. Then she went into the kitchen, flung her gloves down on the table, and said something disparaging about the mess. Aunt Ivy lived a long way away in a big city in Scotland, and yet somehow the Mildews always saw more of her than they would have liked. She had been married to Mr. Mildew's brother, Hugh, who had run away to Africa several years ago and had never been heard from since. The children thought that if they'd been married to Aunt Ivy, they'd have run away to Africa. And here's a picture of Aunt Ivy. Doesn't look very pleasant, does she? They would have run away too, for there was something distinctly off-putting about her. She was tall and spiky looking, with long, elasticy arms and dark, menacing eyes. Since losing Hugh, she had started spending Christmas at Rose Cottage, and she ruined it every time. She always snapped and snarled and gobbled all the chocolates, and her presents got meaner every year. Last time she'd given Arthur a ping-pong ball and Lucy a packet of plastic clothespins. She also had revolting habits, such as clipping her fingernails at the kitchen table and stubbing her cigarettes out in the children's boots. Mr. Mildew had her to stay each year because of something called family duty, which makes people put up with all sorts of awkward things at Christmas time. But it wasn't Christmas now. It was January, and they were all very surprised to see her again. Arthur and Lucy stood at the kitchen door, looking at her in dismay. "Now, do remind me, Ivy, should we have been expecting you?" Mr. Mildew asked, shifting uncomfortably from one foot to the other. Aunt Ivy looked at him contemptuously. "Are you going senile, Walter? We arranged everything on the telephone only last week." Mr. Mildew acknowledged this was possible, for the one thing he never forgot was his own forgetfulness. "Yes, Ivy, of course, but do just remind me. Mice, Walter," she said, drumming her fingers irritably on the kitchen table. At last, Mr. Mildew's memory jogged into action. Ivy had seen not 1, but 2 mice in her sitting room in Scotland, and the sight had so upset her nerves that she had asked to stay at Rose Cottage while a pest control company took up all her floorboards trying to find them. And he had said yes, just to get her off the telephone. Of course, and I've forgotten how long you might stay," Mr. Mildew said, trying to sound more casual than he felt. As long as it takes, Walter, she said defiantly. I've told pest persecutors to turn my house upside down until they find those revolting little creatures. If there's one thing I'd loathe more than anything, it's mice. Aunt Ivy and her 5 suitcases took over the living room. The sofa was turned into a bed, and an entire shelf of the bookcase was cleared to make way for all her makeup and hair dye. Aunt Ivy took a good deal of care over her appearance. She painted her lips red and her eyelids green, and she dyed her hair jet black and parted it in a zigzag. She looked quite sinister. She didn't do any of the normal things that aunts do. She never knitted sweaters, baked cakes, or listened to cheerful music on the radio. She just sat in her kitchen all day long, filing her nails and looking grim. In order to avoid her, the children spent more and more time in the attic, and Mr. Mildew spent even more time than he usually did, locked away in his room. The Nutmouses went to ground, too, because the very sight of Aunt Ivy made them shudder. When she was last here, Nutmeg had seen her standing at the kitchen windowsill, squishing a fly with the tip of her eyeliner, and Tumtum had seen her pouring boiling water on a beetle. He had once heard her telling Mr. Mildew how much she hated mice, and he dreaded to think what she'd do if she ever set eyes on them. So he was determined to make sure she didn't. That morning, when he heard Aunt Ivy's voice ringing from the kitchen, he put a padlock around his gates. Then he drew the bolts across the front door and told Nutmeg that she was not to step foot in Rose Cottage except in a major emergency, such as running out of flour. It is simply too dangerous to venture out while that ill-tempered creature is here, he said firmly, as they sat down to a lunch of cold tongue and potato salad, followed by sponge cake. We must hibernate until she's gone. But what about the children? Nutmeg wailed. We can't stop visiting the attic, Tum-Tum. Imagine how bereft they'll feel. It's not worth the risk, Nutmeg, Tum said. There's something about that woman that makes my spine tingle. Oh, I know, Tum-Tum. She makes mine tingle, too, Nutmeg replied. But we can't let her make us prisoners in our own home, so long as we wait till she's gone to bed. Then it must be safe to move around. A couple of mice have never woken anybody. Tum-Tum looked thoughtful. It was true that every house mouse had the right to roam freely after dark, and they especially wanted to visit the attic that night because they had a rather wonderful present for the children, a 5-pound note that they found shortly before Aunt Ivy arrived, half buried in the snowbank by the lane in front of the cottage. They'd rolled the money into a cylinder, then Tum-Tum had carried it home on his shoulder, and now it was leaning against their kitchen wall, waiting to be delivered. Oh, let's take it tonight, Tum-Tum, Nutmeg squealed for the dozenth time. Tum-Tum finished his sponge cake, untucked his napkin from his collar, and sighed. All right, Nutmeg, he said resignedly. We'll go. But he felt very uneasy about it. Much later, after supper, the mice tiptoed up to their front gate and peeked out under the dresser. The kitchen light was still on, and they could see Aunt Ivy's shadow cast across the floor. She was sitting at the table smoking. They went back to Nutmouse Hall, waited an hour, then crept back to the gate. Aunt Ivy was still there. Really? Nutmeg thought disapprovingly. No wonder she looks so crazy if she never goes to bed. Eventually, at a very late hour, they came to the gate to find the kitchen light turned off. They let themselves out and scuttled through the hall, Tum-Tum carrying the note again on his shoulder. The living room light was on and the door open, but there was no sign of Aunt Ivy. Tum-Tum's ears pricked up as he heard water running upstairs. Come on, dear, he said, turning to his wife. She's having a bath. We can sneak up now. They ran up the baseboard and sped across the landing. They could hear Aunt Ivy splashing about in the bathroom, humming tunelessly. The noise made them both shudder. Finally, they climbed up to the attic, and Tum-Tum climbed onto the dresser and unrolled the note and left it leaning against the mirror. Nutmeg wanted to do some cleaning, but Tum-Tum wouldn't let her. He felt growing apprehension. Not tonight, Nutmeg, he said. We must get back to Nutmouse Hall while Aunt Ivy's still wallowing. So they ate the biscuits that the children had laid out for them in the dollhouse, though neither had had much of an appetite, and then they made for home. But as they were galloping across the upstairs landing, Nutmeg tripped on her apron springs and landed on the floor, all 4 paws in the air. Oomph! It was very painful. Tum-Tum pulled her to her feet. Are you all right, dear? He asked anxiously. Oh, yes, Tum-Tum. Nothing's broken, nothing. Then, oh, bother, she said. fumbling in her apron pocket. "I've dropped the key to the gate. Oh, bother, bother, bother." Tumtum shone his flashlight around, nervously scouring the carpet. Eventually, Nutmeg saw it glinting. There they are, with their flashlight looking. "Oh, I see a shadow. Oh, I don't know." Behind the leg of the dresser. "There it is," she said, squirreling it into her apron pocket. "Now, hurry, dear, do hurry," Tumtum said, tugging her by the paw. But as she did so, the mice were bathed in a brilliant pool of light. The bathroom door had opened, and looming above them was a tall, thin, wet figure wrapped in a white towel. The mice froze, rooted to the carpet in terror. Aunt Ivy froze too. Sorry, this is chapter 5. She hated all animals, unless they'd been turned into coats or gloves or suitcases. But it was mice that she hated most of all. They made her pulse race, and her stomach turn, and her skin crawl, and her eyes pop. And now there were 2 of them confronting her, face to face, on the landing, and they were wearing clothes. And Ivy looked at them in horror, praying that her eyes were deceiving her. One had an apron on, and the other was dressed in a tweed suit with brown shoes, and a pair of glasses strung around its neck. "They're mad mice," she thought wildly, her brain spinning with fear. Then she tightened her grip on the pumice stone in her left hand, raised her arm, and hurled it down upon the Nutmouses as hard as she could. As the gray missile was released, the mice finally came back to their senses, and they scuttled like they had never scuttled before, over the landing, down the stairs, across the kitchen, and under the dresser, where Tumtum fumbled with the padlock, his paws shaking. When the gates opened, he pushed Nutmeg inside his safety and bolted the lock behind them. They could hear Aunt Ivy rampaging upstairs. "Walter, wake up! You've got mice! You've got an infestation of mice wearing clothes," she said, mice with such loathing that Nutmeg's heart fluttered. Mr. Mildew sounded unsympathetic. "You've been dreaming. Now, please, Ivy, go to bed," he said. She eventually did, for it was very late after all. But next morning, the mouse hunt began. From their breakfast table in Nutmouse Hall, the mice could hear her crashing about Rose Cottage, upturning beds and bookshelves, trying to find their hideaway. When she started banging around in the kitchen, the Nutmouses went to spy on her through their front gates. They saw her put down 2 mouse traps, one by the garden door and another next to the vegetable rack. Aunt Ivy always packed mouse traps when she went to the countryside, and in summer she traveled with fly swatters and wasp traps too. Both the mouse traps were baited with little chunks of cheese. "Really," Nutmeg thought indignantly, "she must think us very silly." But Aunt Ivy was not going to wait for them to take the bait. She wanted to find them now. She rummaged in the pantry, then in the cupboard under the sink. She looked in every drawer and in every saucepan. She even looked in the wastepaper basket. Then she approached the dresser. "Stand back," Tumtum ordered, pulling his wife away from the gate. The dresser rattled wildly on the other side of the wall as Aunt Ivy turned out the drawers in the cupboards. "Come out," they heard her mutter. "Come out, you little vermin. I'll show you what happens to mice who wear tweed suits." The Nutmouses trembled. If she moved the dresser away from the wall, she would discover the door to the broom closet, and she would discover Nutmouse Hall. "Oh, Tumtum," Nutmeg said weakly, "what are we to do?" Tumtum squeezed her paw very tightly. Then the rattling stopped, and there was a sudden glare of light. And Ivy was on her knees, shining a flashlight under the dresser. She was so close they could feel her warm breath blowing around their legs. It smelled of coffee. The light beam shone back and forth, then rested on the gates. They were rather fancy gates, similar to the sort one sees in parks, but of course on a much smaller scale. The beam lingered there a while, then a red fingernail reached out and poked the bars. The mice jumped back into the shadows, sweating with fear. Tumtum thought of the tiny iron plaque on the gate post saying Nutmouse Hall and wondered if Aunt Ivy's eyes would be strong enough to read it. At that moment, Mr. Mildew came into the kitchen. "Walter, what's this?" Aunt Ivy asked crossly. "Come and have a look." Mr. Mildew approached her, and she handed him the flashlight. "Under here," she said, getting up to make way for him. "What's that metal grill down there?" Sighing, Mr. Mildew got down on his knees and peered under the dresser. He shone the flashlight about for a moment, then stood up again. I've no idea, he said, sounding preoccupied. A ventilation hole, I suppose. Or maybe it's something to do with the sewage. I think there used to be a lavatory down here once before I moved in. Ew, Aunt Ivy said, shuddering. They heard her go to the sink and wash her hands. We'll have to get pest persecutors to take up the floorboards, just like they're doing at my house, she said. I am not having my floorboards taken up just because you think you've seen a mouse wearing clothes, Mr. Mildew replied, sounding quite unusually emphatic. This house is quite chaotic enough as it is. Aunt Ivy huffed and stomped off to the other side of the room to dig about in the ironing pile. As they heard her retreat, the Nutmouses felt quite weak with relief. Come on, Nutmeg, we're safe for now, Tumtum said, and led her back indoors to Nutmouse Hall. Nutmeg made a fresh pot of tea, and they needed several cups each to calm their nerves. And there he is, looking underneath the dresser. The morning had started off much better for Arthur and Lucy, for they, of course, had woken up to find money on their dresser. Arthur thought that they should spend it all on sweets, but Lucy thought that they should save it in case their father's money ran out altogether. If he doesn't make his crumb-gobbling mouse work soon, there'll be nothing left for us to live on at all, she said gravely. I heard him telling Aunt Ivy so. So we should keep the money in case we need to buy basic things like bread. Lucy had read a book in which a very poor family lived off bread for a whole month, and she was fully expecting that the Mildew family might soon have to do the same. She'd even cut a recipe for whole grain rolls out of an old newspaper magazine. Of course I'll make the mouse work, said Arthur, who tried very hard never to lose faith in their father. And besides, if he doesn't make it work, then this money is hardly going to stop us all from starving, so we should go ahead and buy sweets while we can. This might have turned into an argument, but at that moment the children heard a splintering crash coming from the ground floor. They dashed downstairs, wondering what it could be, and when they peered around the living room door, they found their aunt dragging the old ale chest away from the wall. A china lamp had fallen off it and laid smashed to pieces on the floor. What are you doing? Arthur asked. Looking for mice, she said sourly. It's more than my poor nerves can stand. I came all the way from Scotland because I've got mice there, only to find that this place is infested with them. And yours are different than the ones in Scotland, she added accusingly. Yours wear clothes. Clothes? Lucy asked incredulously. Yes, clothes, Aunt Ivy snapped. I've seen 2 of the vermin so far, parading around in suits and aprons as though they owned the place. But there'll be 2 less by the time I'm through. Lucy looked at her intently, wondering if her aunt was mad after all. She and Arthur had sometimes thought that she might be. Mice don't wear clothes, Aunt Ivy, she said firmly. Aunt Ivy hated being contradicted, so this made her feel even snappier. She had had a frustrating morning, and now she wanted to take it out on someone. Looking up, she saw that Lucy was holding a 5-pound note. Who gave you that? She asked. Her voice had a distinct taunt to it. A friend, Lucy said. And it was true, for Nutmeg was a friend, but she could still feel herself going red. Her aunt was eyeing her coldly, almost accusingly. Well, you must have very good friends, she said with a sneer, creeping into the house and giving you 5-pound notes. My foot. Lucy looked at her aghast. The implication was quite clear. If Aunt Ivy didn't believe they'd been given the money, then she must think they'd stolen it. But that was a dreadful thing to suggest and quite unfair. Lucy was about to turn on her heel and march out of the room, which is what she always did when anyone was being horrible at school. She'd last done it when one of the girls in her class had said that Mr. Mildew looked like a tramp. She found walking away to be much better than getting angry. It left her with the agreeable feeling of having the upper hand. But Arthur was not quite so restrained, and Aunt Ivy's accusatory tone was making him feel all hot and tickly with indignation. It was given to us by a friend, he said furiously, his voice quivering. And does this mysterious friend have a name? His aunt asked spitefully. Yes, Arthur replied impetuously, almost shouting. Her name's Nutmeg, and she's a fairy. She's a fairy of sorts, and she comes and gives us things all the time. And she tidies our clothes and mends the roof and cleans the sink, and we feed her in Lucy's dollhouse and... Arthur, Lucy said warningly, and then he stopped. But they both knew he had done something awful. Nutmeg had said the magic would not work if he told anyone else about her. And now of all the dreadful people in the world, he had told Aunt Ivy. And she was looking at him very beadily. You feed this little friend? I mean fairy? She asked eagerly, struggling to sound friendly, which had never come naturally to her. She no longer cared about the money. This was of much more interest to her. What do you feed it with? Nothing, Arthur mumbled, deciding that he had given away quite enough secrets as it was. But Aunt Ivy's mind had started to whir. Lucy looked at her with a very grown-up, withering expression that took her brother by the hand and led him away. Much later, when the children were outdoors, Aunt Ivy snuck up to the attic to investigate. The ceiling sloped down on both sides, too low for a grown-up to stand up under, so she had to crawl across the room on her knees. She made straight for the dollhouse. Kneeling down, she peered through the kitchen window and saw the little plate piled with biscuit crumbs. Then she pressed her nose to the living room window and saw the mouse hairs on the sofa. And she looked in an upstairs window and saw more mouse hairs on the bed. Here she is, looking inside the dollhouse. Ha! She thought. Fairies indeed, as I thought. Those idiotic children had been feeding mice, and the cheeky little vermin must have been cavorting around in the doll's clothes. Aunt Ivy knelt there, wondering what to do. As long as there was food lying around, the mice were bound to return, so this was clearly the place to snare them. But if she put down a mouse trap, Lucy might remove it. Something more subtle was called for. Aunt Ivy sat and gnawed her lips for a moment, and then she had an especially nasty idea. Poison, she thought cruelly. Tonight, when Arthur and Lucy have gone to bed, I'll creep back up and here and put mouse poison in the dollhouse. Now, mouse poison is a brutal thing which can take a mouse quite unawares. At first, he does not realize he is eating it. Then it starts burning horribly at his insides, and if he swallows it up, there's little chance of recovery, however good his doctor. Aunt Ivy knew how vicious it was, which is why she thought it was such a good idea. Feeling very pleased with herself, she hurried downstairs, wrapped herself in a long black coat, and went outdoors. She turned left out of the cottage gate and walked purposely down the snowbound lane, past the duck pond and the war memorial, until she came to the village shop. As she entered, Arthur and Lucy were just coming out. After all the upset of the morning, Lucy had agreed that they should spend all the money on sweets. After all, but Aunt Ivy did not appear to notice them. There was a strange glint in her eye. Behind the counter, the shopkeeper, Mrs. Patterson, was slowly replacing the lid on a big glass jar of gumdrops. "Do you stock mouse poison?" Aunt Ivy asked tartly, glaring at her. Mrs. Patterson sighed. She did not approve of mouse poison, but she prided herself on stocking everything. She bent her head and started digging in a deep wooden drawer beneath the till. "I don't think we do, Mrs. Mildew," she said. "I certainly haven't ordered any myself, and oh!" Mrs. Patterson stood up again, holding a small red sachet. "You're in luck, love. We have one packet left." Aunt Ivy paid for it hurriedly and tucked it into her pocket. Then she walked back to Rose Cottage with a skip in her step. That evening she bided her time until 10 o'clock, then picked up the flashlight from the hall table, kicked off her shoes, and crept upstairs to the attic. As she poked her head over the top step, she could hear Arthur and Lucy breathing deeply, fast asleep. She slithered across the floor and crawled over to the dollhouse. She shone her flashlight through the kitchen window and saw the plate of crumbs on the table. Then she reached into the pocket of her skirt and retrieved the crumpled sachet of poison. Tearing off a corner with her teeth, she wriggled her thin hand through the dollhouse window and released a sprinkle of the pale powder onto the plate, mixing it in with the crumbs with a long red fingernail. "There'll be two very sick fairies in the morning," she thought nastily, turning off the flashlight. Oh no. Chapter 6. The Nutmouses spent the day in Nutmouse Hall, lying low. Nutmeg polished the great oak staircase, which took her mind off of things a little, and Tumtum dozed in the library, which took his mind off things too. Then there was game pie for supper, and afterward Tumtum read Nutmeg an article in the Mouse Times about lady mice in London having their fur dyed blonde. It made her laugh so much she got the hiccups. "Oh, Tumtum," she said, dabbing her eyes with her handkerchief. "Oh, I do feel so much better. After all, things could be much worse. Aunt Ivy might have moved the dresser, and that really would have been the end of Nutmouse Hall." Quite so, Tumtum agreed. She had a good poke around our gates, and she obviously didn't realize what they were. Our sign must have been too small for her to read. I doubt she'll look under the dresser again. By tomorrow the whole thing will probably have blown over. Feeling much more cheerful, Nutmeg settled down to do some knitting. And Tumtum decided to read some more of the novel he was in the middle of, which was about pirate mice on the River Thames. He got up to find his jacket, knowing the book to be in its pocket. But he looked in the library, and the hall, and the gun room, and the bedroom, and the bathroom, and the dressing room, and the living room, and the ballroom, and the billiard room, and every other room. And the jacket wasn't there. That's odd, he thought, trying to remember where he had last had it. Then he struck a paw to his forehead. Oh dear! He'd taken it off last night while they were having their midnight feast in the dollhouse. He would have to go back for it, as it had his wallet in it as well as his snuff box. He returned to the kitchen, looking rather sheepish. I must go tonight, Nutmeg, he said. If the children find it, they may take things out of the pockets. Nutmeg looked at him anxiously. But what if Aunt Ivy's still on the prowl? She said. If I keep in the shadows, she won't see me, Tumtum replied. I'll be there and back in 5 minutes. We will be there and back in 5 minutes, Nutmeg said firmly, for she was not letting her husband out on his own. Tumtum would have argued, but he saw his wife's expression and knew there was no point. At 11 o'clock, the mice set out. After the dramatic morning, a peace had descended on Rose Cottage. The lights were off and nothing was stirring. When they reached the hall, they could hear the sound of Aunt Ivy's soft snoring carrying through the living room door. Tumtum was carrying a strong flashlight so as to avoid the mouse traps. As well as the 2 in the kitchen, they passed 1 in the hall and 3 on the upstairs landing. Nutmeg looked at them contemptuously. She wanted to attach a rude note to one, but Tumtum wouldn't let her. When they got up to the attic, the children were deeply asleep. On entering the dollhouse, Tumtum found his jacket where he had left it, hanging on the wooden peg on the back of the kitchen door. He put it on hurriedly, patting the pockets to make sure everything was still in place. An instinct told him to go straight back to Nutmouse Hall, but Nutmeg was looking longingly at her mop and pail. Oh, Tumtum, Aunt Ivy's fast asleep, so surely there can't be any harm in doing 1 or 2 little chores now we're here. Tumtum looked uneasy. There was no knowing when Aunt Ivy might wake up, and given her mood this morning, he felt that this was no time for them to be at large. But Nutmeg was so eager, he hadn't the heart to drag her away. Oh, come on, Tumtum, she said, seeing him hesitate. Aunt Ivy never comes up here, and anyway, I won't be long, and I'll just mop Lucy's shoes and dust the bedside tables and darn a sock or 2. She tightened her apron strings behind her back and fetched the mop and pail from behind the door. You sit down and have a little something to eat, she said bossily. Tumtum weakened. The thought of a little something to eat always mellowed him. He scrutinized the meal left out on the kitchen table of the tall house. It wasn't the usual old short bread. Tonight the crumbs were brown and creamy, quite different. He sniffed the plate, and his face lit up. It's chocolate, dear, he said delightedly. They must have bought it with the money we gave them. There were few things Tumtum loved more in the world than chocolate, but since Nutmeg worried that it made him fat, she seldom allowed him to have any. Are you sure you won't join me, dear? He asked, licking his lips greedily. No, Tumtum, she said. You sit down and eat, and I'll get on with things. Then she happily scurried off to start scrubbing. Tumtum sat down at the dollhouse table where the place had been laid. Then he took out his novel from his pocket, put on his spectacles, and opened it in the middle of chapter 7, where his bookmark was. He didn't know what he was looking forward to more, tasting chocolate again, or finding out what happened when the pirate mice stormed the water rat's barge. He decided to do both things at once. He laid the book on the table by his place and started to read. No sooner had the first cannonball struck than the pirates surged forth over the side of the rat's battered vessel, their pistols firing wildly. Engrossed, Tumtum reached a paw toward the plate. Then he raised a great dollop of chocolatey crumbs toward his lips. The rat's captain was below deck, distributing muskets among his petty officers. God be with you, rats, he said as they heard a second cannonball tear into the rigging. He swallowed a mouthful of crumbs, then automatically reached out for more. Captain Rattle crossed himself and led his men toward the burning deck. Tumtum raised his paw back to his mouth and bolted down more of the chocolate, but this time he noticed that it tasted odd. Then quite suddenly, his arms started to shake, and he saw his book drop to the floor. He was feeling very, very strange. And that's our 3 chapters for today. Oh my goodness, what a place to stop. You have to tune in next week to find out what happens to Tumtum. Will he be okay? Did he eat too much? We'll find out next week. And if you're wondering why I'm wearing a hat today, it's National Library Week, and we've been doing a Spirit Week challenge all week long. First day, Monday, was funny socks, crazy socks. Yesterday was your favorite t-shirt, and today is hat day, so I'm wearing a hat with Mickey Mouse on it. Why else? You know, I like Disney stuff. If you have a hat at home, put it on and send me a picture so I can post it on Facebook. And if you participate, you'll be entered into a special raffle for a special prize. Anybody that participates all week long. Tomorrow there'll be another challenge. Every day there's a challenge. Look for it on Facebook. I also sent it out by email. I hope you enjoyed our 3 chapters about Tumtum and Nutmeg today. I hope you'll join in again next week. It's a little chilly out there today, but it's always a good idea to get some fresh air. I've enjoyed reading to you, and you take care of yourselves, and we'll hope to be together again soon. Bye.